My wife looked at me across the kitchen table and said the words I will never forget. My mother is on the floor, and she cannot get up, and you are asking me about a restaurant reservation. I remember exactly where I was standing. Right by the sink, drying a coffee mug, the same chipped blue one my mother gave me 20 years ago. I remember the phone still warm in my hand from the call. And I remember Eve's face. Not shocked, not worried, just annoyed, like I had interrupted something important. That night changed everything. Not all at once, not with shouting or broken dishes. It changed quietly, the way a crack spreads through glass before it finally breaks. And by the time it was over, my wife had lost more than she ever imagined a person could lose in one ordinary week. But I need to start from the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Wesley Watson. I am 53 years old, and for the last 18 years I have coached youth baseball at the same field on the edge of town. Every spring, a new batch of 9- and 10-year-olds shows up not knowing how to hold a bat properly, and every summer I watch them learn. There is something about that work that keeps a man honest. Kids do not care about your job title or your bank account. They care if you show up, if you keep your word, if you are still standing on the field when the rain starts. I learned that lesson from my mother, Rebecca Watson, long before I ever picked up a bat. My mother is 82 years old. She raised me alone after my father passed when I was 11, working 2 jobs, never once complaining where I could hear it. She is the kind of woman who irons her napkins, who remembers every birthday in the family, including ones from marriages that ended years ago, who still drives herself to church every Sunday morning in a car older than some of my players. She is stubborn. She is proud. And she is, without question, the strongest person I have ever known. I want to tell you about her properly, because she deserves more than a few sentences before the story moves on. When I was young, after my father died, money was tight in a way that I only understood once I became an adult myself. My mother worked mornings at a school cafeteria and evenings cleaning offices downtown, and somehow she still managed to be at every single one of my Little League games. I remember looking up into the bleachers between innings just to check, and she was always there, sitting in the same spot, in a folding chair she brought from home because she said the metal bleachers hurt her back. She never missed a game. Not one. Not even the year she had the flu so badly the school nurse sent a note home with me, warning that my mother looked unwell when she picked me up. She still came. She sat in that folding chair wrapped in a blanket, coughing into a tissue, clapping every time I made contact with the ball. That is the woman who raised me. That is the standard she set, quietly, without ever once saying it out loud. Showing up is love. Everything else is just talk. When I was 24, I married Eve. Eve was different back then. Or maybe I just saw her differently. She was sharp, funny, ambitious. She worked in marketing for a downtown firm and always seemed to know which restaurant was new, which wine was good, which people mattered. I found that confident. I found it exciting. My mother found it exhausting, though she never said so directly. She just asked me once, quietly, after the wedding, "Does she know how to sit still with you, or only how to go places with you?" I did not understand the question then. I understand it now. I met Eve at a charity dinner my old college roommate had dragged me to, the kind of event with a silent auction and a string quartet that nobody quite listens to. I was standing near the bar, feeling out of place in a rented tuxedo, when she walked over and asked me, without any introduction at all, whether I thought the chicken or the fish would be the safer bet. I told her I had no idea, since I had skipped dinner to save room for the dessert table. She laughed, a real laugh, not the polite kind people use at events like that. And we talked for almost 2 hours while the silent auction closed around us without either of us noticing. I proposed 18 months later on a weekend trip to the coast, in a moment I had planned for weeks, and that somehow still came out clumsier than I intended. She said yes before I had even finished the sentence, which I took, at the time, as the highest compliment a nervous man could receive. I remember the early years of our marriage fondly, in the way you remember most early things. We were young. We had energy. We had a small apartment with mismatched furniture and big plans neither of us had fully thought through. Eve introduced me to people I never would have met on my own. Restaurant owners, gallery curators, a few minor local celebrities who came through her firm's events. I liked watching her work a room. She had a gift for making people feel important, even people she had just met. What I did not notice, not for years, was who she did not extend that gift to. For years, our marriage looked fine from the outside. We had a nice house, the kind with a manicured lawn and a kitchen island Eve had insisted on, even though neither of us cooked much. We hosted dinners. Eve liked things a certain way, the napkins folded just so, the wine paired correctly, and I learned to keep things that way, because keeping the peace felt easier than asking why the peace needed so much managing. My mother lived 15 minutes away, in the same small house I grew up in. After my father died, she never remarried. She filled her days with her garden, her church group, and her two real joys in life, my visits and her grandchildren when my sister's kids came to town. My sister Donna lived 2 states away with her husband and their 2 children, so most of the day-to-day presence in my mother's life fell to me, which I never minded. I considered it a privilege, honestly, though I rarely used that word out loud because it felt like something you only said in eulogies. Eve tolerated my mother. That is the most honest way I can put it. She was polite at holidays. She sent a card on her birthday, always signed in Eve's clean handwriting, never with a personal note. She referred to her, even to my face, as your mother, never Rebecca, never Mom. Small things. The kind of small things you tell yourself do not matter. I told myself that for almost 30 years. There is a particular memory from early in our marriage that I think about often now. We were at my mother's house for Sunday dinner, maybe 4 or 5 years into the marriage. My mother had made her pot roast, the one she always made for special occasions, and she set the table with the good plates, the ones with the small blue flowers on the rim that had belonged to her own mother. Eve picked at her food and mentioned, almost in passing, that she had read an article about red meat and heart health. My mother, without missing a beat, smiled and said, "Well, I suppose I'll just have to die happy then." It was a joke. Everyone at the table laughed, even Eve eventually, but I remember catching the exact moment before Eve laughed, the half-second flash of irritation, like she resented being made to feel foolish in front of me. After that night, the comments about my mother's cooking, her home, her old-fashioned habits, became a quiet undercurrent in our marriage. Never cruel, never loud, just present, like static on a radio station you have learned to tune out. Every Sunday, I drove over to my mother's house to fix something, or mow her lawn, or just sit on her porch and drink coffee while she told me about her week. Eve rarely came. She had brunch plans or yoga or a headache that arrived suspiciously close to 10 in the morning every Sunday. I want to be fair here, because fairness matters to me, even now. Eve was not cruel to my mother. She never raised her voice at her, never said an unkind word directly to her face. Eve's cruelty, if you can call it that, lived somewhere quieter. It lived in the absence. In the empty chair at Thanksgiving when my mother needed a ride, and Eve said she had a headache. In the silence when my mother called the house and Eve handed me the phone without a single word of greeting, my mother noticed. Of course she noticed. She just never said anything, because that is who she is. She carries her hurt the way she carries everything else. Quietly, with her chin up. I remember once, maybe 10 years into the marriage, asking my mother directly if something was wrong between her and Eve. We were on her porch, the evening cooling down around us, and she set her coffee cup on the small table beside her chair before answering. "Nothing is wrong, Wesley," she said. "Eve has never been unkind to me. She has simply never been present with me. Those are two very different things, and I think you confuse them because you love her." I did not know what to say to that. I still do not, fully. I just nodded and changed the subject, the way you do when someone says something true that you are not ready to hold yet. There was another man in my mother's life during those years, though not in the way that phrase usually suggests. His name is Clinton Webb, and he had lived next door to her for almost 20 years by the time the events of this story took place. Clinton is 71, a retired electrician, the kind of man who still waves at every car that passes, who shovels snow off both his walkway and hers without being asked, who keeps a spare key to her house because she trusts him more than she trusts most of her own family. Clinton's wife had passed away 12 years earlier, and somewhere along the way, without either of them ever naming it directly, he and my mother had become something like quiet companions. Not romantic, not exactly, though I sometimes wondered. More like two people who had decided, independently, that the other one mattered, and who showed up accordingly. He fixed her gutters every fall. She brought him a plate whenever she cooked something he liked. They sat on porches, hers or his, depending on the evening, and talked about nothing important in the way that old friends do. I mention Clinton now because he becomes important later, but also because he represents something I think about often. He was not family by blood. He owed my mother nothing official, nothing legal, nothing written down anywhere, and yet he showed up for her more consistently than some people who shared her last name. That contrast sits at the center of everything that happened next. I think it is worth mentioning one more memory before I move forward, because it shows something important about the kind of marriage Eve and I had built, brick by brick, without either of us ever stepping back to look at the whole structure. About 2 years before the hospital, my mother had a minor health scare. Nothing serious. A stomach bug that left her dehydrated enough to need a quick visit to urgent care. I was out of town that week at a coaching clinic 2 states away, something I had committed to months earlier and could not easily leave. I called Eve from my hotel room and asked her to check on my mother, just to make sure she had fluids in the house and someone to call if things got worse. Eve agreed, in the tone of someone agreeing to water a neighbor's plants. She drove over, dropped off a case of bottled water and some crackers, stayed for perhaps 10 minutes, and left. When I called my mother that evening, she mentioned, almost in passing, that Eve had seemed eager to get back to something, though she did not say what, and I, exhausted from a long day of coaching drills, let the comment pass without really hearing it. I think about that exchange often now, not because anything dramatic happened that week, but because it was so unremarkable, so easily explained away. Exactly the kind of moment that adds up silently over years until it becomes impossible to ignore. There is a particular Tuesday I think about more than any other day in my life. It started like any other day. I had practice that afternoon, a group of 10-year-olds working on their swings, and I remember the sky was that flat gray color, like it could not decide if it wanted to rain. I had spent the morning at the hardware store picking up a part for my mother's kitchen faucet, which had been dripping for weeks, and I had promised her I would fix it that evening after practice. I was packing up the equipment bag, jogging a few of my players through their final drills, when my phone rang. It was my mother's neighbor, Clinton Webb. His voice on the phone was tight, controlled, but tight, in a way I had never heard from him before. "Wesley," he said, "I think you need to come over. Your mother fell in the kitchen. She's conscious, she's talking, but something's wrong with her arm, and she's having trouble breathing right." I felt my stomach drop straight through the floor. "How long ago, Clinton?" "Just now, I heard something through the wall. Came over to check. Found her on the floor. I've already called for an ambulance, but it's going to be a few minutes out here. We're not exactly close to the hospital." "I'm coming," I said. "I'm 25 minutes out, maybe less, if I push it." I told the assistant coach to finish up practice, grabbed my keys, and called Eve from the car, because she was closer to my mother's house than I was. She had left work early that day for a hair appointment, something she had mentioned at breakfast, an appointment she had been looking forward to because the Pratts, friends of ours from the country club, had invited us to dinner that evening at a new restaurant downtown. She picked up on the third ring. "Eve," I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking. "Mom fell. Clinton's with her, but I need you to go over there now. You're 10 minutes away. I'm 25. There was a pause. Not a worried pause, a calculating one. I actually laughed for half a second because I thought she was joking. She was not joking. "Eve, my mother is on the floor and she cannot get up," I said, "and you are asking me about a restaurant reservation." "I'm not asking," she said. "I'm telling you I have plans. Can't Clinton handle it until you get there?" "He's 71, Eve. He's not a paramedic. He's doing what he can, but he's standing there alone with my mother on the floor. And you are 15 minutes closer than I am." "Wesley, I have my hair done. I'm not showing up to an emergency looking like this." I do not remember exactly what I said back. I remember it was sharp, sharper than I had ever spoken to her in 29 years of marriage. I remember hanging up before she could answer, my hands tight on the wheel, running every red light between the ball field and my mother's street, my mind racing through every worst possibility, the kind of thinking that feels like drowning even while you are still breathing fine. When I got there, Clinton was kneeling on the kitchen floor beside my mother, his jacket folded under her head, holding her hand and talking to her in a calm, steady voice, the kind of voice you use to keep someone from panicking. "You're all right, Rebecca," he was saying. "Ambulance is 6 minutes out. Stay with me now." My mother's face was pale, almost gray, and her right arm was bent at a wrong angle beneath her. But her eyes found mine the second I walked in, and even in that much pain, she managed something close to a smile. "Tracked mud on my floor," she said to Clinton, her voice thin. "Wesley's going to be upset about that." That is my mother, cracking a joke about mud on the floor while her own body is failing her. "Mom, don't talk. Just breathe," I said, kneeling down on her other side, taking her free hand in both of mine. Her fingers were cold. I remember that detail specifically, how cold her hand felt against mine, like the warmth had already started leaving her. "I'm fine, Wesley," she whispered, "just embarrassed. 82 years old, and I can't stand up on my own kitchen floor." "You're not embarrassed, Mom. You're hurt. There's a difference." Clinton looked up at me then, and something passed between us, an understanding that did not need words. He had been here, doing this, while my wife discussed hair appointments. She slipped reaching for something on the top shelf, Clinton said quietly. I heard the crash through the wall and came right over. The ambulance arrived not long after that. The paramedics moving with the kind of calm urgency that comes from doing this work every day. They got her arm stabilized, checked her vitals, and one of them frowned slightly at something on the monitor, exchanging a glance with his partner that made my chest tighten. We're going to want to run some cardiac tests at the hospital, the paramedic said to me, as they loaded her onto the stretcher. Her heart rhythm's a little irregular, probably stress from the fall, but we want to be thorough. I rode with her in the ambulance. Clinton followed in his truck, because he said someone needed to move her car out of the driveway and lock up the house properly, and he was not about to leave that job half done. That is Clinton in a single sentence, even in the middle of a crisis, thinking about the small responsibilities other people forget. Eve arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, after her dinner. She walked into that waiting room in a black dress and heels, her hair freshly done from the appointment, looking like she had stepped out of a magazine rather than out of an evening she had chosen over her mother-in-law's emergency. How is she? Eve asked, sitting down beside me, smoothing her dress like it mattered more than the question. I did not answer for a long moment. She broke her arm, I finally said, and her heart did something the doctors don't like. They're running tests. Eve nodded slowly. That's good though, right? That she's stable? I looked at my wife. Really looked at her, in a way I had not allowed myself to in years. You ate dinner first, I said quietly, while my mother was on the kitchen floor. Wesley, I didn't know it was that serious. You can't expect me to drop everything every single time. She's 82, I said. She fell, alone, in her own kitchen, and you finished your appetizer. Eve's jaw tightened. Don't make this into something it isn't. But it already was something. It had been something for years. That night just finally gave it a name. A doctor came out around 9 that evening, a woman with kind eyes and a tired voice that told me she had probably been on shift far too long. She explained that my mother had suffered a small cardiac event, not a full heart attack, but something the medical team called a strain on the heart muscle, likely brought on by the fall itself or the stress surrounding it. Combined with the broken arm, they wanted to keep her for observation, possibly several days. At her age, the doctor said carefully, we want to be cautious. The body doesn't bounce back from these things the way it used to. I asked if I could see her. The doctor nodded and led me back. My mother stayed in the hospital for 4 days. I stayed by her bedside every night, sleeping in that uncomfortable vinyl chair, the kind that leaves a print on your back. Clinton visited twice a day, bringing her the newspaper and a thermos of the coffee she actually liked, because hospital coffee, in her words, tastes like punishment. Eve visited once. She stayed 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock the entire time, because some quiet, hardening part of me had started keeping score. During that visit, Eve stood near the door rather than sitting in the chair beside the bed. She asked my mother how she was feeling, received a short answer, mentioned something about a work deadline, and left. My mother watched her go without a word, then turned to me with an expression I had never quite seen on her before. Not anger. Something closer to quiet confirmation, like a suspicion she had carried for years had finally been proven true, and there was no satisfaction in being right. On the third night, my mother and I were alone. The hospital quiet except for the hum of machines down the hall. She had been drifting in and out of sleep, but she opened her eyes and looked at me with a clarity that surprised me. "Wesley," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." "Anything, Mom." "If I had died on that kitchen floor," she said, "would Eve have come straight from her dinner, or would she have finished her dessert first?" I did not answer. I could not answer. The silence answered for me. My mother nodded slowly, like she had already known, like she had simply been waiting for me to know it too. "I'm not angry at her," she said. "I stopped being angry at people like her a long time ago. I just feel sorry for you, Wesley. Married almost 30 years to someone who sees you as furniture. Useful, convenient, but not someone she'd run for." "Mom, that's not fair to her." "Isn't it?" she said softly. "Tell me one time, just one in 29 years, when Eve dropped everything because you or I needed her. Not eventually. Not after she finished what she was doing. Immediately." I sat there in that vinyl chair and searched my memory the way you search a drawer for something you are afraid is not there. I searched through birthdays, holidays, the ordinary crises of a long marriage, and I came up empty. Not because nothing had ever gone wrong, but because every single time something had, Eve's response had always come with a delay, a condition, a reason it had to wait. "I can't think of one," I admitted quietly. "I know," my mother said. "I've had a long time to notice. I just didn't think it was my place to say it until now." Those words sat in my chest for a long time after that night. They are sitting there still, if I am honest. My sister Donna flew in for 2 of those 4 hospital days, taking time off work and leaving her own family behind to be there. She and I sat together in the cafeteria one evening, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine, and she asked me, carefully, the kind of question siblings only ask when they already suspect the answer. "Where's Eve in all this, Wesley?" "She came once," I said. "Stayed 11 minutes. Donna did not say anything cruel about Eve. She never has, not in all the years I have known her to dislike someone. She simply nodded slowly, the way our mother nods, and said, "I always wondered if you saw it too, or if it was just me." "I saw it," I admitted. "I just didn't want to say it out loud." "Mom's known for years," Donna said. "She told me once that she stopped expecting Eve to show up a long time ago. She said it was easier to be pleasantly surprised than constantly disappointed." That sentence has stayed with me more than almost anything else from that week. My own mother had quietly adjusted her expectations of my wife, lowering them year after year, simply to protect herself from a disappointment she had already learned to predict. My mother came home from the hospital with her arm in a cast and a small bottle of heart medication she now had to take every morning. Clinton drove her home himself, helped set up a recliner downstairs so she would not have to climb stairs while she healed, and started stopping by twice a day just to check on her, the same way he always had, except now with a little more attention, a little more care. Eve never once asked if my mother needed anything during her recovery. Not a casserole, not a phone call, not a single visit beyond that first 11 minutes. I started visiting my mother every single day after that. Not because anything dramatic had happened between Eve and me in the open. We still ate dinner together most nights. We still slept in the same bed. But something inside me had shifted, quietly and permanently, the way a key turns in a lock you did not even know was there. I noticed things differently now. The way Eve scrolled through her phone during conversations about my mother's recovery. The way she changed the subject whenever I mentioned visiting. The way she referred to the entire incident, weeks later, as that whole thing with your mom. Like it was an inconvenience that had passed, rather than a moment that had revealed something permanent about her character. One evening, about 2 weeks after my mother came home, Eve and I were getting ready for bed, and she mentioned, almost casually, that the Pratts had invited us to another dinner, this time to make up for the one we had missed. "We didn't miss it because of anything that needed making up," I said. "You went. You ate dinner while my mother was on the floor." "Are you still on this?" she said, exasperated. "She's fine, Wesley. She's home, she's healing, everyone's fine. I don't understand why you're still punishing me for one bad night." "I'm not punishing you," I said. "I'm just finally seeing clearly." She did not ask what I meant by that. I think, on some level, she did not want to know. About 3 weeks after the hospital, my mother asked me to drive her to see her lawyer. I did not ask why. With my mother, you learn that some questions are not yours to ask. You simply show up, and you drive, and you wait in the car if she wants privacy, which she did that day. She was inside for almost an hour. When she came out, she looked lighter somehow, like she had set something down that she had been carrying for a long while. "Everything all right, Mom?" "Everything is exactly how it should be," she said, and that was all she offered. I did not push, life went on. Eve and I continued our routine, the dinners, the small talk, the careful distance that had always lived underneath our marriage but had never felt quite this wide before. I kept coaching. I kept driving to my mother's house every Sunday, and now most other days too. Clinton and I became something like friends over those weeks. Two men who loved the same stubborn woman in different ways, both showing up because showing up was simply what you did for people you loved. My mother's cast came off after 6 weeks. She regained most of her strength, though the cardiologist insisted on regular checkups and a strict medication schedule, which she followed with the same discipline she applied to everything else in her life. She started gardening again that spring, slowly at first, then with her usual determination, getting her hands back in the soil she had tended for decades. I remember one Sunday afternoon, sitting on her porch, watching her examine a row of tomato plants with the careful attention of a woman inspecting something far more important than vegetables. "You've been here a lot, Wesley," she said, not looking up from the plants. "More than usual, even for you." "I just want to make sure you're all right, Mom." "I am all right," she said. "But I notice things, you know. I notice that Eve hasn't come with you once since I came home from the hospital." I did not have an answer for that. I simply sat there, the porch creaking slightly under my weight, watching her tend to plants that had outlasted more than one difficult season. "You don't have to defend her to me, Wesley," she said gently. "I know what I saw. I know what I've always seen, if I'm honest with myself. I just love you too much to have said it sooner." It was almost 4 months later when everything finally came apart. My mother passed peacefully in her sleep on a quiet Thursday morning in early spring. Clinton found her because he had stopped by with her newspaper and her coffee, the same as every morning, and when she did not answer the door, he used his spare key. He called me before he called anyone else, his voice breaking in a way I had never heard from him before. This steady, old-fashioned man who had never once seemed unsure of anything. I drove to her house in a kind of fog I cannot fully describe, even now. The paramedics were already there when I arrived, gentle and quiet, in the way professionals are when there is nothing left to save, only respect left to offer. The coroner later said it appeared to be her heart, peaceful, in her sleep, in her own bed, in the house she had lived in for almost 50 years. There is a strange mercy in that kind of ending, even inside the grief of it. She did not suffer. She did not linger in a hospital bed surrounded by machines. She simply closed her eyes one night and did not open them again. I will not pretend that grief follows any kind of order. It does not. It came in waves, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming, sometimes disguised as simple numbness while I picked out a casket or wrote her obituary at 2 a.m. because sleep refused to come. I kept reaching for my phone to call her about small things, a recipe, a question about the garden, before remembering, each time fresh, that the call would never connect again. Clinton came to the funeral in a suit I had never seen him wear before, pressed and careful, the kind of suit a man keeps for exactly these occasions. He stood near the back during the service, not because he did not belong closer, but because he understood, in his quiet way, that the front rows belonged to family. Even though he had shown up for my mother more consistently than some family ever had. Eve was present for the funeral. She wore appropriate black, said appropriate things to relatives, stood beside me at the gravesite with her hand resting on my arm, like a woman performing the role of a grieving daughter-in-law rather than feeling like one. I noticed. I think I had been noticed to things like that for months by then. After the service, at the small gathering at my sister's hotel room, I overheard Eve telling one of my cousins that the funeral had been tastefully done, the same tone she used to describe a dinner party or a wedding. I do not think she meant any harm by it. I think it was simply the only language she had for moments like that, the language of presentation rather than feeling. It was 2 weeks after the funeral that my mother's lawyer called and asked Eve and me to come in together to discuss the will. I remember sitting in that small office, leather chairs, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. The lawyer, a calm older man named Harold Briggs, going through the paperwork with practiced patience. Harold had known my mother for over 15 years, had handled her affairs since shortly after my father's estate was settled, and there was a gentleness in how he spoke that told me he had genuine respect for her, beyond simple professional duty. The house, paid off years ago, was left to me. Her savings, modest but carefully built over decades, were split between me and my sister Donna. Her wedding ring, to be passed down to my niece someday. A small collection of jewelry, divided thoughtfully among the women in the family. All of this felt right, expected, the natural order of a mother providing for her children. Then Harold cleared his throat and continued reading. "There is a specific clause here," he said, "regarding the trust fund Rebecca established 11 years ago, intended originally as a joint inheritance for Wesley and his spouse." Eve sat up slightly straighter at that. I noticed the small shift in her posture, the flicker of attention, the way her eyes moved toward the lawyer with something like anticipation. 3 months before her passing, Harold continued, Rebecca amended this trust. The full amount, just under $400,000, has been redirected entirely to a fund benefiting Wesley's nephew and niece for education and future use, with Wesley named as sole trustee. The room went very quiet. "I'm sorry," Eve said, her voice careful, controlled. "Could you repeat that?" "The trust was meant for both of us." "It was," Harold said gently, "until the amendment. Rebecca was very clear in her instructions. She wanted me to read you something she wrote, if this moment ever came." He opened a small envelope, the kind my mother always used for cards, her handwriting visible even from where I sat. "To my daughter-in-law, Eve," Harold read. "I want you to know this was not done out of anger. I do not believe in punishing people out of spite. I made this decision because I watched you choose a dinner reservation over my life, And I understood, in that single moment, something I had quietly known for years. You never saw me as family. You saw me as an obligation you tolerated for Wesley's sake. I do not blame you for not loving me. Love cannot be demanded. But I will not leave behind money meant for a daughter who was never truly there, when it can instead protect the children who actually are. Harold set the letter down. Eve had gone pale, her hands tight in her lap. "This is absurd," she finally said. "She can't just rewrite a trust because of one bad night." "She amended it 3 months before her death," Harold said simply. "It is fully legal, witnessed, and notarized. I'm sorry, Eve, but it is not contestable. I want to add, if it helps at all, that Rebecca thought very carefully about this decision. She did not make it in anger. She made it after watching, over a long period of time, who showed up and who did not." "This is humiliating," Eve said, her voice rising slightly now, the careful control finally cracking. "She's making me look like some kind of monster over one missed visit." "It wasn't one missed visit, Eve," I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the reading had begun. "It was 29 years of missed visits. The hospital was just the last one she counted." Eve turned to look at me, something flashing across her face that I had rarely seen there before. Not anger exactly. Something closer to fear. The fear of being truly seen after years of being only glanced at. I sat there, watching my wife absorb the loss of $400,000 in real time, and I felt something strange and unexpected rise up inside me. Not satisfaction, not exactly. Something closer to clarity. Like watching fog finally lift off a road you have been driving blind for years. Harold gave us a moment alone in the office, stepping out under the pretense of pulling additional paperwork, though I think he simply understood that we needed privacy more than we needed documents. Eve sat very still in her chair, staring at the closed folder in front of her, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. "Say something, Wesley," she finally said, not looking at me. "What do you want me to say?" "Defend me. Tell me this is insane, that your mother was being cruel, that I didn't deserve this." I considered that for a long moment, longer than I think she expected. "I keep trying to find a way to disagree with her," I finally said. "And I can't. That's the part that scares me, Eve, not the money. The fact that I can't find a single argument against what she wrote." Eve's eyes filled, though whether from grief, humiliation, or simple fury, I genuinely could not tell, and I am not certain she could either. 29 years, she said quietly. "And it comes down to one phone call." "It comes down to every phone call," I said. "The hospital was just the one she happened to write down." Harold returned a few minutes later, and we finished the remaining paperwork in a silence so heavy it felt like its own kind of conversation. I signed where I needed to sign. Eve signed where the law required her signature, acknowledging she had been informed of the terms, her handwriting noticeably less steady than usual. We did not speak much in the car on the way home. Eve stared out the window, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming against her knee in that way she does when she is calculating something. "This is humiliating," she finally said. "Your mother made me look like some kind of villain." "She didn't make you look like anything," I said quietly. "She just told the truth about what she saw." "And what exactly did she see, Wesley?" I pulled the car over. I do not know why I needed to stop moving in order to say what came next, but I did. "She saw a woman who finished her dinner while I drove through every red light in town to get to her," I said. She saw a woman who visited her hospital room for 11 minutes and never came back. She saw a woman who in 29 years never once called her by her name. That's not fair, Wesley. I called her plenty of things. You called her your mother. Always. Like she was a category, not a person. Like she belonged to me and not to either of us. Eve opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. I'm not trying to hurt you by saying this, I said. I'm just done pretending I didn't see it too. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. Over the following weeks, something settled inside me that I can only describe as quiet certainty. I was not angry anymore. Not really. I had moved past anger into something steadier. I started noticing, really noticing, all the small moments I had spent years explaining away. The missed calls, the empty chair at family dinners, the careful, polite distance Eve kept from anyone who could not offer her something she valued. I started writing things down, actually, in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand drawer. Not out of spite, but because I needed to see the pattern laid out in front of me, in my own handwriting, to finally believe it was real and not some exaggeration born out of grief. Every entry was small on its own. A missed birthday call, a canceled visit, a conversation steered away from anything that did not directly involve Eve's own interests, but laid end to end, across years. They formed a shape I could no longer pretend not to see. I thought about my mother's question in that hospital room. Would Eve have come straight from dinner, or finished dessert first? I already knew the answer. I had known it for a long time. I had simply been unwilling to say it out loud, even to myself. One evening, about 6 weeks after the reading of the will, I sat Eve down at our kitchen table, the same table where she had once told me my mother's emergency could wait for a reservation. I want a divorce, I said. She did not look surprised. I think some part of her had been expecting it since that day in Harold's office, maybe even since that night in the hospital waiting room. Because of the money, she said flatly. No, I said. Because of everything the money revealed. I should have seen it years ago. I think I did see it honestly, and I just kept choosing comfort over truth. You're really going to throw away 29 years over your mother's grudge. My mother didn't hold a grudge, I said. She held a mirror. I just finally looked into it. And what do you see in this mirror, Wesley? A woman who likes nice things? Who wanted a normal life instead of spending every weekend at your mother's kitchen table? I see a woman who never once, in almost 30 years, treated my mother like she mattered, I said. And I think, somewhere underneath that, you probably never treated me like I mattered either. Not really. Just like I was convenient, reliable, useful, the way furniture is useful. That word landed harder than I expected it to, on both of us. I had not planned to use it. It had simply surfaced from somewhere deep, my mother's own words finding their way into my mouth at exactly the right moment. Eve cried that night, but I noticed, even then, that her tears felt more like grief for a lost lifestyle than grief for a lost marriage. Maybe that is unfair of me to say. Maybe grief looks different on different people. But after 29 years of marriage, you learn to recognize the difference between someone crying for you and someone crying for what they are losing because of you. What will people think? She asked at one point, through her tears. And I remember feeling a strange, quiet sadness at the question, because even in the middle of losing her marriage, her first instinct was about appearances. I don't know, I said. I stopped worrying about that the day my mother died on her kitchen floor, and you were finishing an appetizer. She didn't die that day, Wesley. No, I agreed. But something in our marriage did. The divorce took almost a year to finalize. It was not dramatic in the way movies make these things dramatic. There were lawyers, paperwork, the slow and tedious division of a life built over decades. We argued at times about furniture and photographs, and which friends would keep speaking to which of us. Eve's friends, mostly people from the country club circuit, sided with her, which felt fair enough, since I had never fully belonged in that world anyway, only visited it on her arm. Eve moved into a condo downtown. I stayed in the house, the same house my mother left to me, the house I now keep up the way she always kept hers, garden included, because some habits are worth inheriting. I planted tomatoes that first spring after the divorce, in the same spot my mother always used, and I remember standing there with dirt under my fingernails, feeling closer to her than I had felt in months, like some part of her was still teaching me things even after she was gone. Clinton still comes by sometimes, usually with a thermos of coffee, just like he used to bring my mother. We sit on the porch some evenings and talk about nothing important. Baseball scores, weather, the kind of conversation that fills you up slowly instead of all at once. He never says much about Eve. He never needs to. His quiet loyalty to my mother all those years says more than any words could. One evening, sitting on that same porch, Clinton finally said something close to an opinion on the whole matter. "Your mother was a good judge of character," he said, looking out at the yard rather than at me. Took her a long time to say anything about Eve, though. She wasn't the type to rush a judgment like that. No, I agreed. She wasn't. For what it's worth, Clinton said, I think she was relieved, near the end, that you'd finally see it for yourself. She didn't want to be the one to tell you. She wanted you to arrive there on your own. I sat with that for a long while after he left that evening, the porch light buzzing softly above me, the garden quiet in the dark. I thought about how much patience that must have taken. Watching your son live inside something you could see clearly was hollow, and waiting, year after year, for him to see it too, rather than simply telling him and risking the relationship in the process. That is a particular kind of love, I think, the kind that waits. It took time after the divorce for the house to feel like mine rather than simply a space I was occupying while grief worked itself out. I repainted the bedroom that first winter, a small thing, but it felt important somehow, a quiet declaration that the space belonged to a new chapter rather than an old one. I kept most of my mother's furniture exactly where it had always been, because some things deserve permanence, but I let myself change the things that were only ever Eve's choices, never mine. My nephew, Donna's son, came to stay with me for a week that first summer after the divorce, mostly so Donna and her husband could take a trip they had been postponing for years. He was 12 at the time, full of restless energy, and I taught him to throw a curveball on the same field where I have coached for almost 2 decades. Watching him learn, patient and determined the way his grandmother used to be, I felt something settle in me that I had not expected. A sense that the family my mother had spent her whole life protecting was still here, still growing, still worth showing up for. That is a particular kind of love, I think, the kind that waits. I think about my mother every single day, not with the sharp pain of those first few months, but with something gentler now, something that feels almost like gratitude. She gave me 18 years of baseball seasons and stubborn Sunday mornings and porch coffee. And in the end, even from beyond her own life, she gave me something else. She gave me the courage to finally see what I had spent 30 years too comfortable to look at directly. The trust she left for my nephew and niece has already started doing its work. My sister tells me her daughter, now in her first year of college, talks about her grandmother often, grateful in a way that feels earned rather than obligatory. There is something fitting about that, I think. The money my mother refused to leave to someone who never truly knew her is now quietly shaping the futures of children who will grow up knowing exactly who she was and exactly what she valued. People sometimes ask me if I regret how things ended with Eve. I do not. I regret how long it took me to understand what my mother already knew the moment she watched her daughter-in-law choose a dinner reservation over a fall on a kitchen floor. Some people show up. Some people do not. And eventually, life has a quiet way of making sure everyone ends up exactly where their choices placed them. My mother used to say that character is not what you do when people are watching. It is what you do when you think no one will ever find out. She was right about that. The same way she was right about almost everything. I still keep her chipped blue coffee mug in my kitchen cabinet. I do not use it for coffee anymore. I just like knowing it is there. Some things you keep not because you need them, but because they remind you who taught you how to be the kind of man worth keeping around. I coach baseball still, every spring, the same field, a new batch of 9- and 10-year-olds learning how to hold a bat properly. Sometimes, watching them, I think about how much of what I teach them has nothing to do with baseball at all. Show up. Keep your word. Be there when it matters, not just when it is convenient. I learned that from a woman in a folding chair in the bleachers who never missed a single game, not even the year she had the flu. And if there is one thing I learned through all of this, it is simply this. Love does not announce itself in dinner conversations or anniversary cards. It shows up uninvited, at inconvenient hours, in kitchens with someone lying on the floor. It kneels down beside you with a folded jacket under your head and says, "Stay with me now. Ambulance is almost here." That is the love that matters. That is the love that gets remembered. And in the end, that is the love that gets honored, long after the people who never understood it have finally lost their seat at the table.